It was one of those mornings when everything seemed a little too quiet, like the world hadn't quite woken up yet. The sun was struggling to break through the clouds, casting a muted light that barely touched the pavement. I was running late, which, honestly, was nothing new. The days had been blending together lately, one indistinguishable from the next. I hurried through the streets, my coat flapping behind me, eyes focused ahead as I dodged puddles from the morning rain. I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings, just the usual walk to the bus stop, the familiar rhythm of my steps filling the silence. But then, as I passed the corner shop I always walked by, something caught my eye. It wasn't the shop itself, nothing particularly special about it. It was a small convenience store with the usual array of cluttered items in the window, the faded neon sign blinking intermittently, and a few dusty plants hanging from the ceiling. I had passed this shop hundreds of times, never giving it a second thought. But that day, something was different. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was the way the light reflected off the glass, or maybe it was just an unconscious pull, but I slowed to a halt in front of the window. My reflection stared back at me, tired eyes, half bagged from another sleepless night, coat thrown over my shoulders in the rush to get out the door. But then, the reflection wasn't just mine anymore. In the window, beyond the reflection, the display had changed. The plants, the newspapers, the cans of soup, they were all still there. But something else was there too. Something I had never seen before, a small digital screen embedded in the corner of the window, showing a weather forecast. I didn't recall seeing it there before, but I wasn't sure why I'd noticed it now. It wasn't unusual for shops to have screens showing local news or weather updates, but this one was different. It wasn't showing today's weather. It was showing tomorrow's. I stared at it for a moment, unsure of why it struck me as odd. The screen displayed the date and time, and underneath, the forecast: tomorrow, March 26th, partly cloudy, 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 20% chance of rain. It was accurate, of course, at least from what I knew about the forecast I had seen earlier that week. But it was so specific, down to the exact temperature and chance of rain. I felt a strange tug in my chest, a sensation I couldn't quite place. The feeling wasn't fear exactly, but more like an instinctive unease. I turned away for a moment, just to clear my mind, but when I glanced back at the screen, it had changed. Now, it was showing the weather for the day after tomorrow. March 27th, cloudy, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 40% chance of rain. The exact same weather forecast. Not a guess. Not a broad prediction. The specific numbers, the temperatures, the chance of rain, all of it laid out in front of me with an almost eerie certainty. I stepped closer to the window, pressing my hand against the cold glass, trying to make sense of it. The more I stared at the screen, the more the world outside seemed to blur. It was as if the lines between the present and the future were starting to shift, melting together, and I couldn't stop it. My thoughts raced, and for a split second, I felt like I wasn't supposed to be seeing this. That maybe I wasn't supposed to know. But then, I looked again. The forecast had changed again, this time jumping ahead to a week later. April 2nd, clear skies, 78 degrees Fahrenheit, no rain. The date, the weather, everything was there. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, trying to make sense of it. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone else noticing what I was seeing, but the street was still empty. No one was looking into the window. No one was paying attention to the strange digital forecast. I stepped back, my mind reeling. It couldn't be. The weather forecast for a week ahead, displayed with such certainty, and yet it wasn't the present. It was future information. It wasn't just a mistake on a broken screen or some malfunctioning device. I knew this wasn't something I was imagining. The sensation of dread crept up my spine, slow and insidious. I backed away from the window, my breath shallow as I turned to walk away, my legs suddenly feeling heavy, like I couldn't move fast enough to get away from the strange window. I hadn't taken more than a few steps when I heard a voice. Soft, but clear, like it had been calling my name from far away. I stopped, my heart skipping in my chest. I knew that voice. "Excuse me, are you all right?" I turned to face the voice, and standing in front of me was the store clerk, the same middle-aged man who had always worked there, his tired eyes framed by the gray of his thinning hair. He was smiling, but his expression was oddly vacant, like he didn't really see me. "I'm fine," I said quickly, suddenly feeling a little too hot under the weight of his gaze. I hadn't noticed him standing there. Had he been watching me the entire time? He nodded, his smile widening slightly, as if something about my response had satisfied him. But then, before I could move away, he spoke again, his voice now lower, almost conspiratorial. "You noticed the forecast, didn't you?" I froze. The question hung in the air like a thread waiting to be pulled. "The forecast?" I repeated, trying to play it off like it was nothing, but my voice faltered. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked toward the window, then back at me, his smile now more of a knowing grin. "It's the same for everyone who looks," he said softly, almost as if sharing a secret. "Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's like a glimpse into what's already written." My stomach turned. The strange feeling that had been tugging at me since I first saw the forecast suddenly snapped into place. The unease in my chest bloomed into something sharper, something colder. What was he talking about? "You'll see it again," he added, his voice now distant, like he wasn't really talking to me but to someone else entirely. "But be careful what you know. You can't change what's already been shown." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I had no idea what he meant, what he was trying to tell me. And before I could ask, he turned and walked back into the store, leaving me standing in the street, the fog still swirling around me, the quiet of the city pressing in. I didn't want to look back at the window. I didn't want to see the forecast again. I didn't want to know what was coming. But as I walked away, the echo of his words stayed with me. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The world felt different now, heavier. The future had been laid out in front of me, so casually, so matter-of-factly. But that's the thing about glimpsing the future, it's not like a gift. It's more like a weight, one that settles in your chest and doesn't leave. I didn't check the forecast again. I couldn't. But as I walked back down the foggy street, I had a feeling that the next time I looked, it would show something new. Something else. Something that, like the rest of the future, was already written. And now, I could never forget it. It was just a regular Saturday morning, the kind that usually feels like an invitation to relax, to ease into the weekend with no particular agenda. I woke up late, stretched out in bed for a while, savoring the stillness of the house before the day's usual bustle began. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. It was the perfect kind of morning to make a slow cup of coffee, sit by the window, and simply exist for a while. But of course, I couldn't quite manage that. My phone buzzed on the bedside table, a reminder that there were things to do, errands to run. I sighed, slipped out of bed, and made my way to the bathroom to splash some cold water on my face, hoping it would shake off the sluggishness of the morning. The bathroom was small but familiar. The same white tiles, the same low-hanging light fixture that flickered occasionally, and of course, the large mirror that covered the wall above the sink. I didn't give it much thought as I stood there, brushing my teeth, trying to wake myself up enough to face the day. The sound of the toothbrush scraping against my teeth, the hum of the bathroom fan, it was comforting in its monotony, like a routine that didn't need to be questioned. I spat into the sink, rinsed my mouth, and wiped my hands on the towel hanging next to the mirror. And that's when I saw it. The reflection of a smile. It wasn't mine. At least, not exactly. I froze, the towel still in my hand, my body rooted to the spot. For a split second, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But then I looked closer. There, in the mirror, in the lower right corner, a faint smile stretched across the reflection. The edges were subtle, barely noticeable at first, but it was unmistakable. A soft, friendly smile, the kind of expression I might have when I'm amused by a private thought. Except I wasn't smiling. I stared at the mirror, my heart thudding louder in my chest. There was no one else in the bathroom with me. The door was closed, the house was silent. I wasn't facing the mirror at all. I was looking down, my reflection caught only in the periphery. But the smile, it stayed there, stretched across the reflection, like it belonged to someone else entirely. I took a step back, my breath catching. The smile didn't disappear. It stayed there, still and unblinking. It wasn't malicious, but it was wrong, something about it felt out of place. I wasn't facing it, and yet I could feel its presence, as though it were directed at me. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake the dizziness creeping over me. Was I tired? Was I imagining things? I turned back toward the mirror, watching it carefully this time. But now, as I looked directly at it, the smile seemed to fade, slowly dissolving into the glass. Just as I thought it would vanish completely, I saw something else, *, a pair of eyes*. A pair of eyes that weren't mine. They were dark, deep, hollow, and they stared back at me with a weight I couldn't describe. It wasn't just a glance. They were watching me, studying me, as though they had been there all along, waiting for me to notice them. I froze again. The blood drained from my face as I tried to rationalize what was happening. The eyes, those dark eyes, were staring at me from the mirror, not from my reflection, but from the corners, from some place just outside my field of vision. They didn't belong to me. They didn't belong to anyone I knew. I turned away quickly, panic rising in my chest. What was happening? My mind raced, searching for an explanation, any explanation. I moved to the doorway, my hand shaking as I touched the handle. But before I could leave, I glanced back one last time, my gaze unwillingly drawn back to the mirror. The eyes were gone. But in their place was something else. A figure. A shadow, just at the edge of the glass, almost hidden beneath the soft, flickering light. It wasn't fully formed, just a silhouette, barely visible. A shape that could have been anything, anyone. I couldn't make out the details, but it was there, watching me, waiting. And the longer I stared, the more real it felt. The more alive. I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath ragged, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't stop to check the mirror again. I couldn't. I forced myself down the hallway, away from the bathroom, away from whatever had just happened. My feet moved faster than I thought they would, driven by a frantic energy that made no sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in my own house. That whatever was in the mirror wasn't just a reflection. I tried to go on with my day, tried to pretend it was nothing, just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But the unease lingered, like a shadow, following me. Every time I passed by a reflective surface, I felt that tightness in my chest. Every time I caught a glimpse of myself in a window or a glass surface, I couldn't help but look closer, my heart pounding in my throat, waiting to see if something else would appear. But nothing did. At least, nothing I could see. As the days passed, I thought I had put it behind me, chalking it up to stress, to lack of sleep. But then, one evening, I passed by a mirror in my hallway. The light in the room was dim, casting long, strange shadows on the walls. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, and there it was again. A smile. This time, it wasn't faint or subtle. It was wide and clear, stretching across the reflection of my face. It wasn't mine. It couldn't be. It was too wide, too knowing. And this time, I wasn't alone. The eyes were there again, staring at me, watching me from the edges of the glass. And I realized, with a cold shiver running down my spine, that I wasn't facing them. I never had been. I wasn't facing her. The one who had been standing there all along. The one in the mirror, who was never really me. The day had been long, the kind that drags on without end. The kind that leaves you feeling like you're walking through a fog, both physically and mentally. My shift at work had stretched into overtime, and by the time I stepped out of the office, the sun had long since dipped behind the horizon. The city around me was bathed in the soft orange glow of streetlights, but the world felt oddly muted, like the noise of the day had been turned down to a dull hum. I was tired, drained, but as I walked down the street, I found comfort in the rhythm of my footsteps. The steady clack of my shoes on the pavement, the soft rustle of the autumn leaves beneath my feet, everything felt familiar, routine. I was looking forward to getting home, to closing the door behind me and letting the world fade into the background for a few hours. As I neared my apartment building, I noticed the glass door at the entrance. It had always been there, of course, just another part of the building I had passed through countless times without thinking. But tonight, it seemed different, somehow. The glass glowed in the dim light, almost as though it was calling me, drawing my attention with its clear, smooth surface. I stood in front of it for a moment, taking in the reflection of the building's lobby behind me, the quiet hallway stretching beyond the door. I reached out to push the door open, but before I could make contact with the handle, something caught my eye. It was my reflection. At first, I didn't think much of it. My face looked tired, my shoulders slumped from the weight of the day. But then, as I stared at myself in the glass, something felt off. My reflection seemed different. It wasn't that it looked wrong, per se, but the way I was standing was just slightly off. My posture, the angle of my shoulders, the way my hands rested at my sides, it all seemed a little too deliberate, too perfect. I frowned, my mind trying to process what was happening. My reflection was mimicking my every movement, of course. But something felt wrong. The longer I stared at it, the more I began to notice the subtle differences. My reflection wasn't exactly like me. It was more precise. It stood a little straighter than I did. The expression on its face, though identical to mine, seemed just a bit too calm, too controlled. I looked down at my feet, then back up at the door, and it followed suit. But my reflection seemed to anticipate every movement, like it was already one step ahead. Before I could process what was happening, the door clicked open, without me touching it. I hadn't pushed it. I hadn't moved a muscle. But somehow, the door opened on its own, swinging inward with a soft swoosh of air. I blinked, confused, unsure if I had imagined it. But as I looked at the door, I saw something I couldn't ignore. The reflection of me, my reflection, was already stepping through the door. It moved with an unsettling grace, as though it had been waiting for the door to open, anticipating the moment I would walk in. There was no hesitation, no sign of surprise or confusion. It simply moved forward, stepping out of the glass, as though it had crossed the boundary between the mirror and the real world. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, everything in my mind seemed to stop. The door, still half open, was the only thing separating me from the figure that now stood just on the other side, my reflection standing in front of me, yet not me at all. The reflection, turned to face me. It wasn't like a normal reflection. It was like I was looking at a person, a separate entity, one who had stepped into the world I occupied. My reflection, which had once been a mere echo of my movements, now stood ahead of me, as if it had a will of its own. My pulse quickened, my throat tightening as I took a step back. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The figure stood just a few feet away, its expression calm, too calm. I should have been moving, should have turned around and left, but my feet felt glued to the spot. The reflection didn't move at first, just stood there in front of the door, watching me. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch for an eternity, it did something I couldn't explain. It smiled. A slow, knowing smile. The kind that sends a chill down your spine. A smile that wasn't mine. It was my face, yes, but it wasn't my expression. It was as if the reflection knew something I didn't. Something I wasn't meant to know. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. I needed to get inside. I needed to get away from this thing that wasn't me, yet was made of me. But before I could move, the reflection stepped back, as if giving me space to pass through, still smiling, still watching. It was as if it were waiting for me, as though it knew I would eventually step into its world, that I had no choice but to follow. The door seemed to widen, drawing me in. I didn't know how long I stood there, my mind caught between the growing terror that surged through me and the strange pull that the reflection seemed to have. Something inside me screamed to leave, to run away from the door, to forget the whole thing and pretend it hadn't happened. But the reflection, the figure that had once been me, was waiting for me. Its eyes locked with mine, and I could almost hear it whisper, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. Come closer. I backed away, my legs shaking, but it didn't follow. It stayed by the door, still and patient, its smile lingering in the air like a thread connecting us. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to make sense of it all. The door had closed behind me, the reflection gone, but the echo of it remained. A part of me, some dark, curious part, wanted to return. To step through that door, to see what lay beyond the glass. What would happen if I did? What would it do? But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't move toward it. I couldn't cross that threshold. So I turned away, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys, my mind still reeling. And as I stepped into my apartment, the weight of the door pressing in behind me, I could almost hear the echo of footsteps, footsteps, the hallway, following me, lingering just out of reach. And in the back of my mind, I knew, I hadn't left the reflection behind. It had followed me. Somehow, it was already inside. It was an ordinary evening. The kind where the sky hangs heavy with the promise of rain, and the streets are quieter than usual, soaked with the remnants of a summer storm. I was walking home from a friend's place, my thoughts consumed by the conversation we had just wrapped up. The familiar hum of the city surrounded me, distant car engines, the faint murmur of voices from nearby apartments, but I wasn't really paying attention. I was lost in the rhythm of my steps, thinking about everything and nothing all at once. The street I was walking down was one I knew well. The small, local shops lined the sidewalks, the flickering lights of the storefronts casting shadows on the wet pavement. I passed by a few places I'd been into countless times before, an old bookstore, a bakery with warm smells wafting out every time I walked past, a cafe that was always too crowded but always smelled of fresh coffee. Nothing unusual. Nothing to make me stop or even look twice. And then I passed the shop window. It was just another storefront, with a faded, closed sign hanging in the window. The display inside was dimly lit, showcasing a few old trinkets and some dusty picture frames. The kind of shop you never really notice, tucked into the corner between two busier stores. But this time, as I walked past, something caught my eye. It was my reflection. I didn't think much of it at first. I was used to catching glimpses of myself in windows, the passing reflection just a blur as I moved quickly down the street. But this time, it felt different. My reflection didn't just pass by with me. It lingered. As I continued walking, I felt a strange tug in my chest, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. My reflection didn't keep pace. It stayed behind. I stopped in my tracks, heart skipping a beat, and turned to look at the window. My reflection was still there, perfectly still. It was exactly like me, same coat, same posture, same hair tucked behind my ear, but there was something strange about it. It wasn't following me. It wasn't moving with me. It was just standing there, frozen in place, staring back at me through the glass. I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something unsettling about the way my reflection didn't move, as if it was trapped, waiting for something. I took a step back, my feet stumbling slightly, unsure of what to do. I looked around quickly, as if expecting someone to be nearby, watching, but the street was empty. The evening fog had rolled in, and the world felt distant, detached, like I was in some kind of liminal space. I took another step closer to the window, squinting to see my reflection more clearly. It was identical to me, but somehow, different. My reflection's eyes were wide, too wide, and though the glass was clear, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was looking at me, not just reflecting me, but actively aware of me, observing me. I stepped back again, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure why, but the longer I stared at the window, the more it felt like I was being drawn into something I wasn't supposed to understand. My reflection still stood there, unmoving, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. A few seconds passed, maybe more, before I turned around and started walking again, faster now. I didn't dare glance back, but I could feel the pull of the reflection, as though it was still there, watching me from the shop window. My steps quickened, and the city around me felt more alien with each passing moment. The distant sounds of cars, the shuffling of feet on the pavement, they all seemed muffled now, as if the world itself was pressing down on me, narrowing the space between me and whatever was happening. As I turned the next corner, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the reflection still standing there, still frozen. But the window was empty. There was no one there, no reflection, nothing. Just the dark, dimly lit storefront. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, trying to shake the strange unease from my body. But the feeling lingered, deep in my gut. My reflection hadn't followed me. It had stayed behind. It was like it was still waiting for something. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the remnants of an unsettled mind, tired from a long evening. But the more I walked, the more that feeling stayed with me, a soft whisper of dread in the back of my mind. I had passed that shop window hundreds of times, and it had never felt like this before. By the time I reached home, I was exhausted. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me with a sigh of relief. The warmth of the apartment welcomed me, the familiar smell of coffee from the morning still hanging in the air. I kicked off my shoes and sat down on the couch, trying to shake off the lingering tension. But as I sat there, in the stillness of the apartment, I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. My reflection, it hadn't followed me. It had stayed behind, trapped in that window. And as I stared at my own reflection in the darkened window of my apartment, I wondered, what if it was still waiting? It was just a regular Wednesday evening, one of those uneventful nights where nothing particularly interesting happens, and yet, something about the stillness of the world outside made the smallest details feel significant. I had just finished a long day at work and was heading back home, my footsteps slow and heavy as I walked down the familiar street toward my apartment. The air was crisp, with the remnants of an early fall chill lingering even after the sun had set. The streetlights flickered to life one by one, casting a soft glow across the pavement, and the sound of my shoes tapping against the sidewalk seemed to echo louder than usual in the quiet of the evening. I passed the same old storefronts I always passed, an old bookstore with its window stacked high with dusty paperbacks, a laundromat with the hum of machines running in the background, a cafe where I often stopped for a cup of coffee. But tonight, as I approached the corner shop, something caught my attention. A small shop on the edge of the block that I had walked past countless times without ever really noticing. It wasn't a particularly remarkable place, just a modest, nondescript beauty salon with its neon sign buzzing faintly in the window. But tonight, there was someone inside. I could see her through the glass. A woman, standing at the counter, her back to me as she fiddled with something on the counter, maybe a brush or a bottle. Her face was just out of view, but she was close enough to the window that I could make out the details of her movements. She was fixing her hair, adjusting it in front of the mirror on the wall. The kind of thing people do when they're waiting for someone or killing time, checking their reflection. But what struck me was how still her hands were. She moved her head slightly, as if adjusting a strand of hair, but her hands, they didn't move. They stayed perfectly still in the air, suspended in place as though frozen. I blinked, thinking maybe the reflection was playing tricks on me. Perhaps the angle was off, or maybe she was simply holding her hands at an odd angle, but there was something about it that didn't feel right. I stopped walking for a moment, unsure whether to keep going or step closer to get a better look. The way her hands were suspended in the air, unmoving, unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite explain. It felt like I was witnessing a moment that didn't belong to me, as though I was intruding on a scene I shouldn't have been able to see. I could feel the unsettling quiet of the moment pressing in on me, the stillness of her reflection clashing with the rhythm of my own heartbeat, which was beginning to quicken. I took a few steps closer, my feet moving almost of their own accord, my eyes fixed on her reflection. The salon had a large window, and the lights from the inside flickered slightly, casting an odd shadow across her face. She had the kind of face that seemed both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, as though I had seen her before but couldn't place where. The way she stood there, eyes fixed on her reflection, felt both intimate and distant. But still, her hands didn't move. I glanced around, as though expecting someone else to notice what I was seeing, but the street was empty. No one else was walking by, no cars on the road. The world seemed oddly silent, the air thick with a tension I couldn't put into words. I found myself stepping closer to the window, my reflection now merging with hers, both of us framed by the glass. I stood just outside the door, barely a foot away from the woman inside, and yet I felt as though we were separated by some invisible boundary. Her hands remained frozen, still hovering in the air. And then, without any warning, her head turned. It wasn't a gradual movement. It wasn't a subtle shift. She simply turned, her face now fully visible, her eyes locking onto mine through the window with a gaze that was sharp and piercing. Her expression remained unchanged, but her eyes, those eyes, felt like they were staring into me. It was like she was looking straight through me, as though she knew exactly what I was thinking. For a second, I thought my heart had stopped beating. My breath caught in my chest, and I instinctively took a step back. But the woman, she didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stood there, her gaze unblinking, as if waiting for me to do something. I felt like I was trapped in that moment, my mind spinning, my body frozen in place. And then, slowly, her lips parted. The woman's mouth opened, but instead of speaking, she made a sound. A soft, low whisper, so faint I could barely hear it through the glass. But I heard it. Asterisk, come closer. Asterisk, the words were quiet, but they sliced through the stillness, like a knife cutting through the thick air. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. Her voice carried an unmistakable weight, like it was meant for me. But I couldn't move. I couldn't bring myself to approach the window, even though everything inside me was urging me to do so. I took another step back, my heart racing, the cold sweat gathering on the back of my neck. The woman didn't speak again. Her hands remained suspended in the air, unmoving, as though she were holding onto something unseen. Her expression didn't change, and yet, somehow, the tension in the air felt thicker, more oppressive, as though the world had narrowed down to that one moment, that one look. I turned away quickly, not daring to look back, and kept walking. My feet carried me down the street, faster now, away from the salon, away from the woman and the strange, frozen moment I had just witnessed. My mind raced as I walked, replaying the scene over and over in my head, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't look back, but as I continued down the street, I could feel her presence, the weight of her eyes on me, still following me. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching, waiting for me to return. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I ever truly left. I never went back to the shop. I passed by it many times in the weeks that followed, but I couldn't bring myself to look at the window again, couldn't bring myself to see her hands suspended in the glass, waiting. But every time I walk past that shop, I can't help but feel like she's still there, standing behind the glass, waiting for me to come closer. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right and the evening is still, I think I hear a faint whisper, like the soft rustle of air between the panes of glass. It's always the same. Asterisk, come closer. The sun was high in the sky that afternoon, the kind of bright, harsh noon that seems to melt everything beneath it. The streets were practically empty, save for a few pedestrians walking quickly, heads down, trying to avoid the oppressive heat. I was on my lunch break, walking aimlessly through the quiet city block, the air shimmering with the heat radiating off the pavement. I hadn't intended to wander so far from the office, but the sunlight, as sharp and unforgiving as it was, always made me want to move in slow, deliberate steps, to make the most of whatever shade I could find. I turned a corner, my shoes clicking softly on the sidewalk, and that's when I saw it. A puddle. It wasn't much, just a small, shallow thing, barely the size of a dinner plate, but it caught my eye. I wasn't sure why at first. It wasn't the size or the shape of it, but something about the way it reflected the world around it seemed strange. The puddle lay in the middle of the street, where the asphalt had buckled slightly under the weight of time and traffic, the edges softening into the dirt. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, as I walked closer, I noticed that something wasn't right. The puddle didn't reflect the noonday sun or the bright blue sky above it. Instead, it was reflecting a sky full of stars. It wasn't just one or two stars. It wasn't some fleeting illusion. The reflection in the puddle was clear, perfectly still, showing a night sky, deep, dark, and impossibly full of stars. Every constellation, every flicker of light, was visible in the shimmering surface, shining bright against the reflection of the buildings and trees around it. It was as though the sky had turned itself inside out, showing the heavens as if it were midnight. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the sight. I knelt down, getting closer to the puddle, hoping to understand what I was seeing. The world around me was too ordinary, too real, to match what was in the puddle. I could feel the heat of the sun on the back of my neck, the sharp glare of the midday light hanging in the air, but all of that seemed irrelevant next to what I saw beneath me. A sky full of stars. A reflection of a night that was never meant to be seen in the middle of the day. I blinked, thinking it was just some trick of the light, some optical illusion caused by the shifting air. I moved to the side, trying to get a different angle, but the reflection remained unchanged. It was as if the stars in that small patch of water were untouched by the brightness of the sun, unbothered by the heat, existing on their own terms, in a space that didn't belong to the world I knew. I looked around quickly, wondering if someone else might be seeing this too, but the street was still quiet, and no one was nearby. It was just me and the strange, star-filled puddle. I leaned down even closer, my breath catching slightly as I reached my hand out toward the water. I half expected it to feel cold, to feel like something from another world, but when my fingers grazed the surface, the water was warm. It felt like any ordinary puddle, its edges soft and slightly rippled from the light breeze that had begun to stir the air. Yet the reflection of the stars didn't waver. It stayed perfectly still, as though they were frozen in place, as though they were always meant to be there. I felt a sense of unease creeping up my spine, but I couldn't pull myself away. There was something mesmerizing about the way the stars remained steady, untouched by the sun or the world around them. I wanted to understand why the sky had spilled into this small, mundane puddle, why it had reflected such a peaceful, tranquil night in the middle of a day that was anything but. My hand hovered just above the surface, a part of me drawn to it, another part of me telling me to step back, to leave it alone. But just as I was about to move away, something shifted. The reflection in the puddle wavered for a moment, like the stars themselves were adjusting, stretching, and then, I saw it. In the reflection, the stars weren't alone. There was something else. A shadow. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but as I watched, it grew, stretching across the sky in the puddle, like a figure moving through the stars. It was difficult to make out at first. It didn't have a clear shape, but I could tell that it was moving toward the center of the puddle. The shadow seemed to swirl around the reflection, as though it were interacting with the stars themselves. I pulled my hand back, startled, my heartbeat quickening. The shadow in the water was becoming clearer now. It was darker, more defined, and I could see that it wasn't just a figure, it was waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for me. And just as I stood up, trying to shake off the rising panic, I heard a sound. A soft whisper. It came from the puddle itself, carried on the air like a murmur just beneath the surface. "Look closer," it seemed to say. "Don't turn away." I stumbled back, my foot catching against the edge of the sidewalk as I stepped away from the puddle, my mind spinning. What had I seen? What had just happened? I turned around, my breath shallow, my pulse racing in my ears. The stars, the figure, the whisper, it didn't make sense. I glanced back once more, my eyes darting toward the puddle. It was still there, still reflecting the same night sky, the same stars, the same shadow that now seemed to hover just outside the edges of the water. But when I looked closer, I realized that the shadow wasn't waiting anymore. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it began to stretch outward, as though the stars themselves were reaching for me. I couldn't look anymore. I turned and walked quickly down the street, the world around me suddenly feeling colder, more distant. My thoughts were racing, my heart pounding, as I tried to make sense of the strange moment I had just experienced. I didn't know what I had seen. I didn't know why the stars had appeared in that puddle, or what the shadow meant. But as I walked away, the whisper lingered in my mind. Look closer. Don't turn away. And I realized, with a chill crawling down my spine, that I might never be able to forget what I had seen. That something I couldn't explain, had been waiting for me to look into that puddle. And now, it was following me. It was a late evening when I boarded the train, the kind of train ride where everything feels like a slow blur, a hum of movement and distant chatter, the gentle rocking of the carriage as it glided through the city's darkened streets. The city outside the window was a canvas of lights, the buildings stretching upward, their windows glowing softly in the night. I had just finished a long day, and my mind was tired, worn from the demands of work and the long hours that had felt like an endless blur of motion. The train was relatively empty, save for a few quiet passengers scattered throughout the car. I didn't mind the solitude. It gave me the space I needed to just be still. I found a seat near the window and settled in, letting the rhythm of the train soothe my restless thoughts. The glass was cold beneath my hand as I rested it on the windowsill, my reflection staring back at me through the darkened glass. My tired face looked back at me, eyes heavy, the weariness of the day etched into my features. I stared at my reflection for a moment, caught in the quiet of the train, before I turned my attention back to the world outside. The train rattled along, the city slipping by, and I could feel the tiredness in my body pulling me closer to sleep. My eyelids fluttered shut for a moment, but then something tugged at the edges of my awareness. I felt it before I saw it, the faintest flicker of movement in the window. When I opened my eyes, I saw it. My reflection again, but it was different. My face was distorted, a slight tremor in the way it appeared in the window. The lines of my features, the familiar shape of my face, were blurred for a moment. But what caught my attention, what made my heart beat harder, was the faint shimmer that lingered in my eyes. It wasn't just a reflection of me anymore. The eyes looking back at me were full of something I didn't recognize, something painful. My face was crying. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a split second, I thought I might be imagining it, the result of too many long hours or exhaustion creeping up on me. But no. The tears were real. My reflection was crying, tears streaming down my cheeks, pooling at the edge of my chin, dripping onto the window. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The face in the window, my face, looked just as confused as I felt, eyes wide and filled with silent grief. The expression wasn't one of sadness that came from deep within me, from some hidden well of emotion I couldn't quite access. No. This was something else. Something foreign. I raised a hand, as if to wipe the tears away, but the reflection didn't follow. My hand hovered in the air, a few inches away from the glass, frozen, as the reflection's tears continued to fall. It was as if my reflection wasn't just a mirror of me, it was an entirely different entity, something separate from the person I knew, a version of myself that existed outside of my control. I looked around quickly, desperate to make sense of it, but the train was quiet, the other passengers absorbed in their own worlds, unaware of what was happening. My reflection, myself, was crying, and yet no one else seemed to notice. My hand moved toward the window again, this time to touch the glass, as though I could reach through it and comfort the face looking back at me. The tears continued to fall, slow and steady, the reflection's eyes wide with an expression of helplessness that mirrored the knot in my chest. But as I moved closer to the glass, something else happened. The reflection started to distort even further, as though the face in the window was beginning to unravel. The tears didn't stop. They became more than I could process, more than I could explain. It was like the reflection was becoming a version of me I didn't recognize, one that was other, one that had slipped into a different state of being, a place of anguish I wasn't aware of. And then, in the midst of that strange, silent crying, the reflection, my reflection, smiled. It was a faint, unsettling smile, one that didn't match the sadness in the eyes. It wasn't the kind of smile you give when you've found comfort, when you've made peace with your emotions. It was the kind of smile that seemed to say I know something you don't, like an expression of quiet, knowing detachment. I pulled my hand back from the window, feeling a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. This wasn't me. This wasn't a version of me that I recognized. The reflection had become something else, something twisted. The train jolted slightly, a sharp lurch as it moved through a bend in the track, and for a brief moment, I thought I might lose my balance, my mind spiraling into confusion. When I looked at the window again, the reflection was gone. There was nothing left but the city outside, the dim glow of the streetlights and the passing blur of buildings. I blinked rapidly, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to gather my thoughts, to reassure myself that it was just a trick of the light, just my imagination playing games with me. I reached up and touched my face, feeling the coolness of my skin, the steady rhythm of my own breath. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had seen, what I had felt, was real. The tears were gone. The face in the window had returned to its familiar, tired state, just as I remembered it. I leaned back in my seat, the weight of the strange encounter pressing against me, unsure of what to make of it. Was it a vision? A trick of my mind, worn thin from the weight of the day? But deep down, I knew. The smile, the tears, the feeling of someone else in the reflection, it wasn't just a trick of my tired eyes. Something had shifted, something that I couldn't explain. As the train pulled into the next station, the doors opened, and the rush of cold air filled the cabin. I stood up to leave, moving slowly, my feet heavy as I made my way toward the door. The other passengers moved around me, but my mind kept drifting back to the reflection, the face that had cried, the smile that hadn't belonged. And just before I stepped off the train, I glanced back at the window one last time. For a brief second, just a flicker, I thought I saw my reflection again. But this time, it wasn't crying. It was smiling. And I wasn't sure which one of us was real anymore. It was one of those quiet afternoons where the city felt like it was holding its breath. The kind of day that hangs between seasons, where the heat of the summer lingers but the chill of fall starts to creep in. The sun was weak, casting long shadows on the sidewalk as I walked back from the small cafe on the corner, a cup of coffee in my hand, the steam rising lazily in the cool air. I was just a few blocks from my apartment, lost in thought as I made my way down the familiar streets. The world was moving around me, people walking by, cars idling at the stoplights, but everything felt muted, like I was in a dream. I passed by a small flower shop on the corner, its window cluttered with pots of bright blooms, their colors soft against the gray of the city. The store was one of those places you only notice if you're really looking, small, tucked away, but always inviting. And as I walked past, I noticed her. She was standing on the other side of the street, near the corner, her silhouette framed by the fading sunlight. A woman, tall and slender, wearing a light coat that fluttered slightly in the breeze. She wasn't doing anything unusual, just standing there, her hands tucked into her pockets, staring across the street. But there was something about her that caught my eye. At first, I thought I had seen her before. She looked familiar in a way that was almost disorienting, like a person from a dream or a face from an old memory I couldn't quite place. Her posture was relaxed, but there was an intensity in her stillness, something about the way she stood that made me pause. And then, just as I slowed my pace to take a closer look, she waved. It wasn't a big wave, just a small, friendly gesture, a quick raise of her hand, fingers curling in a gentle arc. But I froze in place, my heart skipping a beat. She was waving at me. The strange thing was, I didn't recognize her. I didn't know who she was, yet the wave felt too familiar, too personal, like we were old friends, like we had shared some unspoken connection. I stared across the street, my hand still gripping the coffee cup, unsure of what to do. I looked around to see if anyone else was nearby, but the street was still. No one seemed to be paying attention. She was still standing there, watching me with a soft smile, as if she knew exactly what I was thinking. The wave wasn't an invitation to cross the street, but rather a quiet acknowledgement, as though she were waiting for me to respond. I took a hesitant step forward, ready to raise my hand in return, but then something stopped me. The moment I moved, I saw something in the corner of my eye. It was her reflection. It wasn't a reflection of her on the other side of the street, but in the flower shop window. I blinked, confused for a moment. Her reflection was standing much closer, just a few feet from me, right beside the window. And yet, she was still standing across the street, on the other side, waving at me. The reflection was perfectly still, her face serene, but it didn't make sense. How could she be in two places at once? Her reflection, her exact image, was right in front of me in the window, standing as if she had been waiting there all along. Her hand wasn't waving, but instead, it was resting gently on the windowpane, as though she was right there beside me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. The reflection was so clear, so vivid. The details were impossible to ignore, the slight tilt of her head, the way her eyes seemed to follow me, not across the street but right where I stood. The reflection was closer now, only a few feet away from me, its proximity too intimate, too personal. I stood there, frozen, as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was I imagining this? Was I seeing a reflection of myself in some strange, distorted way? But no, I was certain. The reflection wasn't mine, it was hers. It was her. But she was still across the street, still waving at me, still smiling from a distance. I glanced back at her, but she hadn't moved. Her hand was still raised, the same wave, the same smile, but now there was a weight to it, a kind of expectation. The distance between us felt more pronounced now, more significant. I was no longer sure where the line between her and her reflection began. The window seemed to separate the two worlds, but it was all the same image, the same woman, the same face, one far across the street and the other right next to me. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The reflection didn't move. It stayed exactly where it was, beside the window, as if it were waiting for me to make the next move. But I couldn't bring myself to cross the street. I couldn't bring myself to approach her, not with that strange reflection so close, so unsettling, standing there as if it had always been there. I felt a sudden chill despite the warmth of the day, as though the air had thickened, pressing in around me. I couldn't understand what was happening, what I was seeing. The woman across the street was still waving, still smiling, but now it felt wrong. The separation between us, her reality and the reflection, was starting to feel too thin, too fragile. I glanced at the reflection again, and for a moment, I thought I saw it shift. Her hand on the windowpane seemed to twitch, just slightly, as if the reflection were aware of me, of my hesitation. And then, with a final lingering glance, I turned and walked away, my pace quickening, the image of her still waving etched in my mind, the reflection haunting my thoughts. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I reached the next block, I felt the weight of something following me, as though the reflection, the woman across the street, was still there, waiting for me to return, waiting for me to cross the street and meet her halfway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that window wasn't the same as what was standing across the street. And I didn't want to find out what would happen if I ever did. It was late in the evening when I left the office, the usual tired weight of the day pressing against my shoulders. The city outside was quieter now, the streets emptying out as the night settled in. The soft hum of streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows against the pavement. I moved quickly, my footsteps echoing in the nearly silent hallway of the building as I approached the elevator. My mind was somewhere else, 1,000 things still running through my head, but for once, I was looking forward to heading home, putting the stress of the day behind me. I pressed the button for the elevator, and as the soft ding echoed through the corridor, I stepped inside. The elevator was empty, the familiar scent of disinfectant mingling with the stale air. I pressed the button for the ground floor and leaned back against the wall, letting out a small sigh of relief. The doors slid shut, and the elevator began its descent, the faint hum of the machinery accompanying the slow, steady rise and fall of the car as it moved through the building's shafts. The floor numbers blinked in sequence as the elevator descended, but something caught my attention in the reflection of the glass doors. I didn't think much of it at first, just the usual reflection of the elevator's interior, my tired figure standing there, my coat slightly wrinkled, my hand resting on the railing. But then I saw it. It was subtle at first. A shift in the reflection. A movement in the glass doors that I hadn't expected. It wasn't me. Not exactly. I stared at the reflection of myself. But as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. My reflection was still inside the elevator with me. But it wasn't standing still like I was. It was moving. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. In the reflection, my figure, my reflection was still, exactly as I was in the moment, standing in the elevator. But there was something else happening in the glass. The reflection of me was moving, pacing, shifting slightly, as though it were a step ahead of me, walking in a pattern I hadn't made. My reflection didn't just mimic my actions, it was doing something else entirely. It was alive in a way that I wasn't. The reflection was smiling. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My reflection's expression was different from mine. It wasn't the neutral look I had on my face. No, it was a strange, calm smile. A smile that felt almost too knowing, too deliberate. It wasn't my smile. It wasn't my movement. My reflection was moving in a way that I didn't. The slight tilt of my head, the shift in the posture, it was like the reflection was a person standing beside me, not just mirroring me but acting on its own. I turned to look at the doors, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, someone playing a prank or perhaps some other explanation that would make sense of what I was seeing. But the elevator was still empty. There was no one else inside. No one was behind me. And yet, in the glass doors, I saw it. My reflection, still pacing in the same confined space, smiling that same unnatural smile. My stomach dropped, and I took a half step forward, my eyes fixed on the glass doors, trying to make sense of what was happening. My reflection did the same, but it took a step forward as well. I felt my heart race. My reflection wasn't following me. It was leading me. It was ahead of me. And that smile, it never wavered. I pressed the button for the ground floor again, as if somehow that would break the spell, but nothing changed. The elevator continued its descent, the numbers on the panel above flickering steadily, but the reflection kept moving ahead of me. It was like my reflection was aware of me, aware of the space we shared, but it was in complete control. It wasn't me anymore. It was something else, something that had taken on a life of its own. I could feel the weight of it pressing in on me, the unease settling deep in my chest. What was I seeing? What was happening? I reached out instinctively, but as my hand moved toward the door, so did my reflections. It was mimicking me, but it was also ahead of me, always just one step ahead. I could feel the air in the elevator grow thicker, colder, as if something was shifting in the very space between us. It wasn't just the elevator descending. It was like the world itself was narrowing, the gap between what was real and what was reflected beginning to blur. When the elevator reached the ground floor, the doors opened with a soft ding. But my reflection didn't stay behind. It stepped out first, moving before I did. I watched, frozen, as my reflection, not me, stepped forward into the lobby of the building. It was the same reflection, the same face, the same body, but it wasn't me who had moved. It was as though the reflection had taken its own life, its own path, and was no longer just a mirror image of me. It had walked out first. I should have moved. I should have followed it. But I couldn't. My feet were stuck to the floor of the elevator, and I couldn't move, couldn't bring myself to step out. It wasn't me who was outside. It wasn't my body that had crossed the threshold. It was my reflection, leading, moving ahead of me, its smile still lingering in the air. I don't know how long I stood there, watching as my reflection, the other me, disappeared into the lobby, swallowed up by the dim lights of the building. It wasn't until the doors began to close that I snapped back into my body, my chest tight, my head spinning with confusion and fear. I stepped out of the elevator, my legs shaky beneath me, my mind racing to explain what had just happened. But when I turned to look toward the lobby, the reflection wasn't there. There was no smile, no figure leading me forward. It was just me. I don't know what happened in that elevator. I don't know why my reflection moved on its own, why it walked out before I did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me. That the reflection, the other me, had already taken the first step into something that I hadn't yet understood. And as I walked into the lobby, I felt it behind me, in the quiet hum of the lights, in the cold shadows of the hall. That smile. Waiting. It was one of those nights when everything felt too still, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The kind of night where the air is thick with silence, and the shadows stretch longer than usual. I had spent the evening at a friend's house, a casual gathering of people I barely knew, and I wasn't quite sure why I had stayed so long. I was tired, eager to leave, but something kept me there, lingering in the background of conversations I couldn't bring myself to engage in. I said my goodbyes and made my way out, the cool night air brushing against my face as I stepped outside. The city around me seemed unusually quiet, the streets empty, the buildings dark. I lived a few blocks away, so I started walking, my steps slow and deliberate as I tried to shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like a sense of being watched, a creeping awareness that someone, or something, was just out of sight, just out of reach. As I walked, my thoughts were a tangled mess, not quite focused on anything. The streets were nearly empty, and I was almost halfway home when I passed an old building, one I had seen 100 times before but never really noticed. The windows were dark, the door locked and barred. There was a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall just inside the door, positioned so it faced the street. It was one of those mirrors that had been there so long it had almost become part of the scenery, faded gold frame, chipped corners, the glass slightly distorted with age. I don't know why I stopped. I don't know what made me look at it, but something in my gut told me to. Maybe it was the stillness of the night, the silence that seemed to stretch forever, or maybe it was just the odd feeling that something wasn't right. I paused for a moment, standing there in front of the mirror, my own reflection staring back at me. But then, as I looked, something caught my eye. I saw a movement behind me, a shift in the reflection that shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought it was just the way the light hit the glass or the angle of my body in the mirror. But when I looked closer, I realized something was wrong. There were people standing behind me. A crowd. They weren't visible in the real world, not in the street behind me, but they were there, clearly reflected in the glass. I could see them, standing in the darkness just outside my own reflection, just beyond the edges of the mirror. The figures were indistinct, their faces blurry, their bodies shifting in strange, subtle ways. They didn't move as people move. They were still, frozen in place, like they were waiting for something, for me. I stood there, staring at them, a cold shiver creeping down my spine. My reflection didn't change, but the crowd behind me was impossible to ignore. They were watching me, their presence a weight that settled deep in my chest. The longer I stared, the more I could make out, there were too many of them. Too many for the narrow space behind me. They seemed to fill up the reflection, crowding together, their outlines indistinct but somehow real. I should have walked away. I should have turned and left. But I was frozen. My legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in place, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? Was it my imagination? But no. I could see them. I could see the way they were positioned, standing too close together, some of them leaning forward slightly as if they were about to speak, but none of them did. None of them moved. And then, slowly, very slowly, one of them raised their hand. It wasn't a wave or a gesture of any kind. It was just a slow, deliberate lifting of a hand, the fingers stretching outward, as though reaching for something. Or someone. For a moment, I felt my stomach turn. My heart skipped a beat, and I found myself moving closer to the mirror, drawn in despite every instinct telling me to run. I leaned in, just a little, trying to see them more clearly, trying to make sense of what was happening. The air around me seemed to grow colder, thicker, like the night itself was closing in. And then, just as I was about to pull away, the crowd shifted. They moved. The figures behind me in the reflection didn't just stand still anymore. They surged forward, closing the gap, their presence growing larger in the glass. The hand that had been raised in the air was now reaching directly for me, fingers outstretched toward my reflection, as if they were about to touch the glass, to cross into my world. I staggered back, the sudden movement pulling me out of the trance I had fallen into. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned to look around the street. But no one was there. The street was empty. The world around me was still silent. No crowd. No one was behind me. Just the empty street and the distant glow of the streetlights. But when I looked back at the mirror, they were still there. And now, they were closer. They weren't just behind me anymore. The crowd was filling the entire reflection, their faces clearer, more defined. And though I couldn't hear them, I felt them watching me. Their eyes were hollow, like they had no life behind them, but they were aware. A cold, sickening awareness settled over me, and for the first time, I realized that they weren't just reflections. They weren't just in the mirror. They were waiting for me to step into their world. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The air felt too thick, the night too still. I could feel them in the reflection, their eyes following me, their hands outstretched, waiting for me to return. And as I ran, the echo of my footsteps seemed to fade into the background, swallowed by the silence. But in the distance, in the corner of my mind, I could still feel the crowd, just behind me, just within the glass. And no matter how far I walked, I knew they were still waiting. Waiting for me to look back. She was separated from me by the window, a barrier that felt both physical and psychological. And then, as I watched, she moved. Slowly, deliberately, her hands sliding down the glass until they reached the bottom. Her fingers, pale and delicate, traced the edges of the window, almost like she was trying to reach me, trying to make contact. My heart beat a little faster, a strange unease creeping into my chest. I told myself it was nothing, a passerby, maybe, who had stopped to rest or just watched the night go by. But something about her stillness, the way she held herself, felt wrong. And then, she did something that made my breath catch. She touched the window. Her hand pressed against the glass, just where I had been standing, just inches from where I was watching. The gesture was so simple, so quiet. But it felt like it carried so much more weight, like it was meant for me. Her handprint was left behind, dark and stark against the misty window, as if she had left a piece of herself in that glass. But then, just as quickly as she had touched the window, she moved away. The faintest flicker of motion, and she was gone. Vanished. The window was empty again, the handprint still visible, but there was no one there. I stood there for a moment, frozen, staring at the glass. The imprint of her hand, pale, clear against the fogged window, lingered in my mind, even as I turned away. There was nothing left. No woman. No sign of her. Only the faint handprint that seemed to burn into my vision, as though it were meant to stay there forever. I shook my head, trying to clear the strange thoughts that swirled in my mind. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Or a reflection. There was no one inside the building. It was an old structure, abandoned for months. The windows had been sealed shut long ago. But even as I walked away, I could still feel the impression of that handprint in my mind. When I reached my apartment, I couldn't shake the image from my head. It lingered like a shadow, a presence that was still with me, despite the normality of my surroundings. I tried to distract myself, putting on music, brewing tea, trying to settle into the comfort of my own space. But every time I glanced out the window, I felt it. That eerie pull. The sensation that something was still there, still waiting outside in the dark. Later that night, after I had changed into my pajamas and settled into bed, I decided to check the window. I don't know why, but I had to. Maybe it was the lingering sense of unease, or maybe I just needed to prove to myself that nothing was out of the ordinary. I stood in front of the window, my hand resting lightly on the cold glass. I looked out at the quiet street below, the dim streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Everything seemed calm, normal, as it should be. But then, I saw it. The handprint. It was still there, faint but clear against the glass. It shouldn't have been possible. I had locked the windows when I got home. The apartment had been empty. I hadn't touched the glass since earlier that evening. But there it was, the same handprint, darker now, clearer, as if it had been left there just moments ago. I stepped back, my heart racing. I hadn't imagined it. The handprint had stayed, a mark that shouldn't have been there, as if someone had touched the glass from the other side. And then I heard it. A soft tapping, light but deliberate, coming from the window. It was quiet at first, but it grew louder, like someone was gently knocking. I turned toward the window, my breath caught in my throat. The handprint was still there, but now it was moving, as though the shape was shifting, expanding. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The tapping continued, each knock vibrating through the glass, echoing in the quiet room. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The window was silent again, the handprint fading slightly in the dark. But I knew something had changed. Something was different. The next morning, when I woke up, I tried to forget the tapping, the handprint. I told myself it had been a dream, a trick of the mind, some overactive imagination. But every time I glanced at that window, the lingering presence of the handprint stayed with me. And in the stillness of the morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still outside, just beyond the glass. Waiting. Watching. It was a typical Friday afternoon, the kind that seems to stretch endlessly as you count down the hours until the weekend finally arrives. The office was unusually quiet. Most people had already packed up and left for the day, eager to start their weekends. I sat at my desk, finishing up some last-minute emails, my eyes tired from staring at the screen for hours on end. The clock ticked by slowly, and I kept telling myself that I'd leave as soon as I wrapped up a few more things. I finally closed my laptop, gathered my things, and stood up, stretching the stiffness from my back. It felt good to move after being hunched over the desk for so long. I grabbed my coat from the back of my chair and made my way to the hallway, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly in the quiet office. As I passed the bathroom, I felt the sudden, almost subconscious urge to check myself in the mirror, just a quick glance to make sure my hair wasn't sticking out at odd angles and my tie wasn't crooked. Routine, nothing more. I stepped into the restroom, the soft hum of the lights overhead mingling with the sound of water running from the sink. I walked up to the mirror, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a normal reflection, my tired face staring back at me, my expression neutral as I checked the angle of my tie. I didn't think anything of it, but then something strange happened. My reflection blinked. Before I did, I froze, my eyes fixed on the mirror. My reflection, blinking, a split second before I even had the chance to. It wasn't a delayed movement, not a trick of the light. It was as if the reflection was ahead of me, waiting for me to follow its lead. I blinked, almost automatically, and the reflection did the same. But the strange feeling didn't leave me. I stood there for a moment, staring at the glass, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I thought maybe it was some kind of optical illusion, some weird trick of my tired mind. But it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate, like my reflection was waiting for me, controlling the movements. I took a small step forward, my heart racing just slightly now, as a strange unease began to creep into my chest. The reflection, stayed still, mirroring my every movement, but something felt off. The way it seemed to anticipate my actions, the way it moved with me but never after me, it was unnerving. I leaned in closer to the mirror, my eyes narrowing as I watched my reflection. It was just like me, same face, same posture, same tired eyes, but there was a presence behind it, a stillness that felt alive. I raised my hand, slowly, in front of my face, and my reflection did the same, but this time, I could see it clearly. It moved a fraction of a second ahead, raising its hand before mine even reached my face. The movements were small, almost imperceptible, but I noticed them. And each time, my reflection seemed to anticipate my next move. This time, I didn't follow it. I paused, my hand hovering in the air, just inches from the mirror. My reflection, still, didn't move. I watched carefully, wondering if it would mirror me, waiting for the slightest motion to see if it would follow. And then, before I could make the first move, my reflection raised its hand again. But this time, it didn't stop at just mirroring me, it paused, holding the gesture, its fingers stretched, perfectly still, as though it was waiting for me to respond. The seconds ticked by, but the reflection didn't change. It stayed frozen, holding that gesture, its eyes locked with mine, and the more I stared, the more unsettling it became. I couldn't bring myself to move. I don't know how long I stood there, caught in the silence, watching my reflection do nothing but wait. My heart began to beat faster, a growing panic surging through me. Why wasn't it mimicking me? Why was it waiting? My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't control, my gaze still locked onto the mirror. Suddenly, the door to the bathroom creaked open behind me, and I heard footsteps in the hallway. I blinked quickly, breaking the eerie moment, and turned around, my pulse quickening. The sound of footsteps brought me back to reality, and when I turned back toward the mirror, the reflection was normal again, mimicking my every move, as it should. I let out a shaky breath, trying to steady myself, my legs feeling weak as I stepped away from the mirror. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to see anything else that might confirm what I had just witnessed. But I had to. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I glanced at the mirror one last time. Nothing had changed. My reflection was just me. Nothing out of place. No strange anticipatory movements. No waiting gestures. I walked out of the bathroom quickly, trying to convince myself that what I had seen had been a trick of the mind, that it was just my exhaustion playing with my perception. But the feeling lingered. I couldn't shake the thought of my reflection, ahead of me, leading my movements, waiting for me to blink first. And as I walked down the hallway, my heart still a little too fast, I couldn't help but wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't blinked? What if I had just kept watching, not following, but waiting instead? What if my reflection would have done something else? What if, for once, I hadn't been the one leading?